Hey there, this video is going to be a long-term review of, in my opinion, Sony's best video camera, the FX3. And by best, I mean the most versatile and reliable for most people in a lot of different situations. If you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Josh, and on this channel I focus on videography, content creation, and of course camera gear. So if you're into that kind of stuff, then you're in the right place. If you're not new to the channel, you know that I've tested and reviewed pretty much every camera I get my hands on in the last few years. So in this video, I'm gonna have a little bit of a chat about my experience owning and using the FX3 over the last few years. So why am I making this video? Well, I own too much camera gear, and maybe you do too. And I've been really trying to pare down what I own to just carry less stuff and to try to sell some stuff, and really in that process, trying to decide on what I really need, what is the most versatile, and how I can get away with having less gear. And what I really came to conclude was, if I just owned two FX3s, I could probably do 95% of what I do. Now, of course, there are other cameras that work better in very certain situations, but the versatility of the FX3 cannot be understated. It can do so many different things. And every time a new camera release comes out, I compare it to the FX3 from other brands as well, but even specifically with Sony, where it seems like they're releasing a camera every few weeks, I immediately think, is that better than my FX3? And the answer usually is no. So I've owned either the A7S III or the FX3 since they came out. The A7S III came out in October 2020, and the FX3 was released in 2021. Of course, they have the same internals, so they're very similar cameras, but it's had a place in my camera bag basically since both of those cameras came out. Now, the main things, as I said early on in the video, I want to talk about are going to be versatility and reliability. This camera can be used for almost any project, and it's super reliable because it has a fan in it. And I've said several times on this channel, if you need a reliable video camera, make sure it has a fan in it. The FX3 can be used for narrative work. It is, of course, Netflix approved, and it's been used in some big budget recent feature films like The Creator. So here's Gareth Edwards, the writer and director of The Creator, talking about the camera that they decided to use for their movie.
We shot The Creator on a new camera, it's a Sony camera, it's called an FX3. Pretty much the whole movie shot on this. It's a camera you can buy at Best Buy. Yeah. It looks like film. It's full frame, full IMAX resolution, and has filmic, like really photographic quality to it.
So the fact that Gareth Edwards was able to use the FX3 to produce The Creator speaks volumes to the image quality and versatility of that camera. So in addition to big budget films and narrative work, you can also use it for documentaries, corporate work, interviews, real estate, weddings, social media, content creation, podcasting, live streaming, and pretty much whatever you can think of. So in the process of trying to figure out which cameras to keep and to sell and try to pair it on my kit, I've obviously had a lot of conversations with friends and colleagues for people that own the FX3 and don't own the FX3. And I've had a lot of conversations with my buddy Thomas Loves, who's a filmmaker and content creator out in California, who owns both the C70 and the FX3. And in discussing the FX3 and why we love it so much, he decided that he would like to share his thoughts here with you guys.
What's up, everyone? My name is Thomas Loves. I'm a freelance cinematographer and YouTuber based in Southern California, and I've been using the Sony FX3 for a handful of years now, and it's absolutely changed the direction of my career. Back when I first bought it, I was on the Pocket 6K, which that's a whole different conversation. I wasn't really the biggest fan of that camera, especially for like the run and gun jobs I was getting, but I spent a lot of time with the Canon C70 working with Samuel Elkins, and I immediately fell in love with that camera, but it was way out of my price range at the time. So I was kind of holding off for like a run and gun, small, compact, mirrorless setup that would give me pretty much the same experience as the Canon C70. And I held off, and then the Sony FX3 ended up coming out, and it immediately caught my eye, so I rented it. And on that trip that I rented it for, I fell in love with it, and I knew I had to have it. The main draw for the Sony FX3 for me was that it basically was the Canon C70 in a smaller and cheaper compact body. I had XLR inputs, IBIS, autofocus, dual base ISO, incredible image quality, 10-bit 422, 4K files, which was the same as the C70 at the time. And I immediately threw this camera into my workflow. I used it for weddings, YouTube, social media gigs, as well as client work where I needed the highest image quality possible. And it was amazing because I was able to take this camera on so many different types of jobs, and it meshed in with a lot of these workflows. It truly feels like an A and a B camera, kind of like in itself. Since buying the FX3, I picked up the Canon C70, which the FX3 kind of does 90% of what the C70 does for me. I got the C70 because of the internal RAW, the DGO sensor, and the internal NDs. But after almost a year with the C70, I can kind of see myself selling it off, replacing it with a Komodo, and having the FX3 fully take over all those gigs where I would most likely bring the C70 on. All those run and gun projects for client work where I don't have that much time and I need autofocus. It's just really hard to justify bringing the C70 around because it's so much larger than my FX3, and I can run the FX3 fully stripped down, be fully incognito, and still have incredible image quality. But I'm still holding on to the C70 because I do prefer the image out of it, but the FX3, it really does give it a run for its money. Thanks, Josh, for inviting me on. I absolutely love this camera. If you guys are kind of second guessing the FX3, I highly recommend it. Peace, guys. See you later.
Thanks for sharing, Thomas. I agree with everything you said there, and Thomas is a really talented guy, so I highly recommend you check out his YouTube channel. I'll leave that link down below. Now, I want to talk about how I personally use this camera. So I've used this on lots of different kinds of things. I've shot a lot of documentary type projects with the FX3, and the main reasons for that is the fact that it's a pretty small form factor and it's easy to move around because it's very light and compact. It also has great audio options with the XLR top handle. It has fantastic dynamic range and great autofocus. And the other thing is, because it has a fan in it, it doesn't overheat, because I was filming a lot of these documentary type videos on farms. So I was lugging around across long distances out in the heat and the sun. I'm here in North Carolina. So the ability to use a versatile camera like the FX3 for those kinds of projects was just absolutely awesome. I've also used this for lots of different kinds of interviews, so both formal lighted interviews where I'd either use a pair of FX3s or an FX3 and like an A7 IV, something like that. It's really great because it has awesome dynamic range and autofocus and the audio options, so it can be used in those situations great because they don't require a lot of gear. You can have two FX3s, a couple lenses, and you're good to go. I've also used this in sort of more doc style run and gun interviews that have natural light. And of course, like I said before, dynamic range, autofocus, and how compact the camera is really great for stuff like that. I also use the FX3 for all of my professional real estate work, and for a bunch of reasons. First of all, like I said before, it's very reliable out in the heat here in North Carolina, and I'm shooting everything in 4K 60. I basically use this camera with my Sony 24-70 G Master Mark II on my Ronin gimbal. And I made a video about all the gear that I use to do this, and I'll leave that video linked down below. But another thing I want to point out is that the color science in this camera matches really well with the DJI drone. So I use the Mavic 3 Classic, and I find that the image cuts really well between the FX3 and the Mavic 3, and it's really easy to get them to match. And just my workflow is very quick when I'm pairing the FX3 with that drone. So absolutely fantastic camera for real estate. And of course, having a ton of dynamic range is super important, because a lot of times when you're shooting inside to outside or things, on certain sides of the building and stuff like that, having a lot of dynamic range is really helpful. I've also obviously made a ton of YouTube content with the FX3, both for this channel and my farming channel. I've used it extensively on my farm and other farms when I'm out in the heat and it doesn't overheat and the autofocus is reliable and stuff like that. I've also used the camera for podcasting and live streaming. And lastly, I do want to mention that you can use the camera for photography, which I actually do use sometimes for taking thumbnails and random stuff. I'm not much of a photographer, but the fact that it does take pictures is awesome in a video focused camera. So I know I've gone on and on about versatility and reliability, but what are some of the things that I love about the FX3? First of all, the form factor. I love that it's small and portable. It's video focused. All of the buttons on here are geared towards video. We have buttons for peaking and zebra, for ISO, white balance, and iris. These are buttons that are things you'd use on a regular basis if you're shooting video. Also, you have tally lights all over the camera, which is really helpful in a lot of situations. And you can easily rig this camera up to make it into a much bigger camera if you want it to just look bigger, or if you need to add other video accessories like follow focuses, monitors, stuff like that. In terms of the ergonomics, I'm not the biggest fan of Sony's ergonomics on their cameras, but of all of them, this is probably my favorite. It has a nice deep grip. I like how it's compact. I like how it looks a little bit different than the mirrorless cameras. So of all the Sony cameras, this one's definitely my favorite in terms of the ergonomics. Also, the fact that we have the XLR top handle, which is not the best in terms of build quality, but I do like that it has two bolts that bolts on the camera, because as opposed to the Sony XLR K3M or like the Tascam units and stuff that go on the other cameras where it just kind of has a lock on the hot shoe, this bolts in. So this is fantastic because it's pretty compact. It comes with the camera. You get two phantom powered XLR professional audio inputs, and you have a stereo input on the 3.5. So you can actually push 4 channels of audio into the FX3. And I've done that several times when doing documentaries and stuff like that, where I need a really small package and I don't want to run separate audio. So the fact that you can do professional audio with this camera with that handle makes again, increases the versatility of this. I keep going on about the fan, but no overheating. The lens options are just limitless, basically, on the FX3. Sony has so many E-mount lenses. There are a whole bunch of third-party options out there. And in addition to that, it's really easy to adapt other lenses. So for me personally, when I'm adapting vintage lenses or cinema lenses, I'm often buying EF lenses because I can use those lenses on the FX3, my Red Komodo, my Canon cameras, and it gives you just so much flexibility with the E-mount because there are just so many native options as well as the ability easily to adapt to other systems. The FX3 can shoot full frame 4K 120 with a small crop, and that is not common in all the video cameras out there. And the video quality is the same all the way up to 120. It looks awesome. And you have 3 different codec options in all of those frame rates. So you have, 3 different compression levels for 10-bit 422 to record internally. You also have the ability to record externally in RAW, which I made a video about, and I'll leave that video link down below. It's not something I do on a regular basis, but you do have that option. The FX3 has IBIS, which in my opinion is not a huge thing either way for me personally, but it is nice to have it. If I need a really stable shot, I'm gonna put this on a tripod or a gimbal. But if you need a couple of quick shots or you're vlogging or your workflow is a little bit different, you have the ability to use IBIS, which I think is really cool in a small body like this. This camera has autofocus, and not all cinema cameras do or don't have great autofocus. So the ability that I can, rely on the autofocus here for interviews, for filming myself, stuff like that is absolutely fantastic. It doesn't have all the newest AI autofocus features that are in some of the newer Sony cameras, but for what I use, very reliable and definitely very usable. It has great battery life, and even with this small battery, the small Sony battery, I don't have to stress about battery life on this camera. I can throw a couple batteries in my bag and I'm good for the whole day. So that's fantastic. It has dual card slots, which isn't in every camera. And the fact that both card slots take both CF Express Type A and SD gives you a lot of flexibility. Whenever I'm shooting client work, I always record redundantly to 2 cards in case something happens to a card. I don't have any issues with that. And so to me personally, when I'm doing professional work, I always dual record because I just don't want to take a chance there. As I said earlier, you can take photos, and a lot of people like to rip on the FX3 or A7S3 for only having 12 megapixels, but for a lot of situations, social media content, family stuff, some professional work, stuff for the web, for me personally, taking thumbnails, it works great. The FX3 is a fantastic B camera to cameras like the FX6 and the FX9. So if you have your big A cam and you want to add something that's a little bit smaller and cheaper, FX3 is a great bet because it matches so well. You can fly it on a gimbal and just won't have any reliability issues. And again, the autofocus is great. So the other thing is that the FX3 has been really supported by Sony with firmware updates. And it really does suck that they haven't been taking care of the A7S III and the A1 and cameras like that. But the fact that they are supporting this with firmware updates goes a long way. And the camera's changed a lot over the last few years. And it just means that, Sony is supporting this camera moving forwards. In terms of image quality, I really don't have many complaints about the FX3. It looks great in a lot of different situations. And a big part of that is the great dynamic range, which I've talked about several times already. Shooting an S-Log3 on this camera with the 10-bit 422 codec is very flexible and easy to grade. And I really do like the highlight roll-off on the FX3 sensor over some of the other mirrorless cameras out there. And most of you know this has great low light performance with its dual base ISOs of 800 and 12,800. It's kind of its party trick. So if you're shooting nighttime stuff, low light events, weddings, having that second base ISO comes in real handy. And I really do think of this as a 2 base ISO camera. I generally don't recommend shooting anywhere in between. I recommend 800 or 12,800 because it does get pretty noisy in the middle ISO range. The FX3 also has great rolling shutter performance, mainly because of its lower megapixel count and just really fast readout. So for video, it's really helpful not having a lot of rolling shutter. So what are some other video focused cameras that are roughly in this price range? Now, I could probably make a comparison video with all of these cameras individually, but I just want to briefly mention them here. So first of all, the Canon C70. One of my favorite cameras of all time, and I know Thomas owns one and mentioned it in his video there too. I also agree with Thomas that I slightly prefer the image out of the C70, and I do like having built-in ND filters, but the FX3 is more versatile for me because it's smaller, and it's also a lot easier to film yourself and use for content creation and flying on a gimbal. For me, like I said earlier with my real estate stuff, this just makes so much more sense than using a C70 and probably a speed booster. It's much bigger and heavier. So this is more versatile of a camera to me than the C70. Now, the R5C can get tossed into this discussion too, although the R5C is a very different camera because it is really a split hybrid camera for photo and video with a 45 megapixel sensor on the R5 photo capabilities. The big differences for me is the FX3 is smaller and has much better battery life, and it's just a little bit easier of a camera to use. It's a little bit less cumbersome, and obviously you have way more lens options with the FX3. So the R5C is in the mix, but in my opinion, the FX3 is just more versatile. We can talk about the red Komodo as well, which I own the Komodo, and I really prefer the image and the R3D codec on the Komodo over anything the FX3 can produce. But it's a very different camera, and you have to have a much slower workflow and be more deliberate with how you shoot with the camera. And as much as I do love the Komodo and use it whenever I can, I reach for the FX3 more often because it's more versatile and it's just smaller and quicker and easier to use. I do want to mention some of the Lumix cameras like the S5 II and the S5 IIX. They're both fantastic cameras with a lot of video capabilities and have great value, but I think they do fall short in a couple ways against the FX3. The big thing for me is the higher frame rate. So they only have a crop 4K 60 and they don't have 4K 120. Now I don't personally use 4K 120 a lot, but not having full frame 4K 60 is a bummer for me for my real estate stuff. I just don't think they're quite at the level of a camera like the FX3. But whenever Panasonic does come out with their S1 cameras, like the S1H Mark II, those cameras are going to be absolutely incredible and will really compete and probably beat out the FX3 in a lot of ways. I do want to mention Blackmagic just recently announced their Cinema Camera 6K, which is a full frame L-mount camera. The big differences there are it doesn't have autofocus and it's a much bigger body, worse battery life, a little bit harder to use. This is just, as I said, more versatile and quicker, but I'd be curious to see how that is. I'm sure the image is going to look absolutely incredible on that, but having autofocus is handy in a lot of situations. So comparing against Sony's own cameras like the A7S III, which has basically the same guts inside as the FX3. A7S III, I know a lot of people still love because it has an EVF, and I totally understand that. This is just more video focused, a little bit smaller of a form factor, and of course it's been more supported by Sony, which is frustrating, but that's the reality. But you could go either way because they both produce great images, and I really haven't heard about the A7S III overheating in a lot of situations. Of course, we can talk about the FX6 as well, which again has the same sensor and processor as the A7S III and the FX3. The big advantages of the FX6, you're going to get ND, the built-in electronic ND filter, which is just absolutely incredible. You also have SDI. You can control the noise reduction, which I really wish we could do in the FX3 because you can take more control over your image and save more of the detail and sharpness and stuff like that, and then apply noise reduction in post if you want to. I know you can shoot RAW on the FX3 and bypass that, but having the ability to shoot that in the FX6 is awesome. And I do think the image quality in the FX6 is just slightly better for whatever reason than the FX3. Now, the form factor on the FX6 is a pro and a con. I think it looks great for clients. They do enjoy seeing a big camera when you're on, when you're out filming and doing your productions. But I think it's more versatile to have a smaller package. And a lot of times I've considered picking up the FX6 again. I had it a long time ago. I think, man, the FX3 can be used in more situations, even though you might have to add a few things, but you can rig this camera up, but you can always keep it really small. All right, so the FX3 is not perfect. There is no perfect camera. So what are some things that I would like to see in the FX3 Mark II or whatever else they call it down the line? So first of all, let's talk about resolution. This camera's got a 4.2K sensor, which oversamples to UHD and DCI, and it gives a really nice filmic look to it. But personally, I'd like to see 6K in a camera like this. And what that does is it gives you a little more detail and sharpness and suppresses the noise. I think 6K is kind of the sweet spot right now without jumping up all the way to 8K and having much larger files. Cameras like the red Komodo have a 6K sensor and they look absolutely amazing. And also, in addition to be able to record the 6K oversampled 4K internally in the camera, I'd love to see a 6K RAW option. I want to see shutter angle in the next version of this camera. This is a cinema camera or a video focus camera, whatever you want to call it. Now, most mirrorless users are used to changing the shutter speed when you change frame rates, but to me, the shutter speed or shutter angle is not an exposure tool. That's just set at whatever it is. So I'd really like to see shutter angle in here. It's a small quality of life thing, but it makes a big difference for video users. I'd also like to see Sony's cinema operating system get put in the FX3, just like the R5C does. I think that was one of the biggest features of the R5C is that when you switch over to video, it goes into the cinema operating system. And it also seems like there's some special sauce in the image quality with the cinema operating systems in Sony and Canon. So I would like to see that and make this feel more like a video camera. I'd love to see ND filters in here. Sony has the best electronic internal variable ND filter, and we just saw them put that in the same body with IBIS in the Sony Burano. So I'm hoping that it trickles down into smaller cameras and they can figure out the tech to get it in smaller bodies. I would give up IBIS in this camera to get NDs in there. And I'd also say, like, just make the camera a little bit bigger. That's fine with me. I would love the ability to control noise reduction, which I talked about before. This camera has a lot of noise reduction built in, and I would really love the ability to turn it off and then apply it in post. I'd love to see open gate recording. This is a feature that's in a lot of newer cameras from Fuji and Lumix. I don't see why we can't do that. It gives you a lot more options for reframing and just different size ratios, but also allow you to use higher squeeze factor anamorphic lenses. In addition to that, I'd like to see more anamorphic support. So this somewhat recently got the 1.3 and 2 times anamorphic support in a firmware, but I don't know why we can't see 1.5, 1.6, 1.8. Those are fairly simple things that you can get in any monitor. I don't see why you can't put that inside the body. It's just squeezing the image while you're monitoring it. I'd love to see a better LCD screen. Most of you know the LCD screens on these Sony cameras are absolutely terrible. I don't understand why we can't get a better LCD screen. This is like a $4,000 camera and it looks awful. You pretty much have to have a monitor on this if you're doing critical focus or stuff like that. So it's handy for, you know, content creation, filming yourself, having a built-in, you know, LCD screen, but there's no EVF. We just need better screens on these. I'd also like to see some monitoring assist tools like waveform and false color, which are pretty common in cinema cameras. This is still using zebras and a histogram, which are photography tools. So I'd like to see more video focus features in that regard. So again, FX3 is a great camera. You can use it in a ton of different situations. And if you are thinking about picking up an FX3, even though it's 2.5 years old, don't hesitate. It's going to be a great camera for years. There's so many people using them and relying on them on a regular basis. And even if a camera comes out soon that would be an update from this, the FX3 is going to be really valuable for a long time. If you're curious about how to set up your FX3, I did make a detailed user guide here and also a video here about how to shoot RAW on the FX3. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.